You think your modern life is difficult with its digital distractions and economic anxieties, but you wouldn't last a single day in the Harlem of the mid-20th century. Modern comforts have softened the edges of survival, obscuring the raw, visceral endurance required to navigate a world where the law was not a shield but a weapon, and where survival depended on understanding codes that were never written down. To understand why you would fail to survive 24 hours in Ellsworth, Bumpy Johnson's Harlem, you must first understand that this was not merely a neighborhood in New York City. It was a sovereign state operating under shadow laws, a place that mirrored the perilous, monster-filled journey of Homer's Odyssey in its complexity and danger. The environment Bumpy Johnson ruled was a synthesis of the desperation born from the Great Migration and the intellectual flowering of the Harlem Renaissance, all underpinned by the violent necessity of protecting a community that the formal state had largely abandoned. If you were dropped into central Harlem between the 1930s and the 1960s, the first thing that would break you is not a gangster, but the environment itself. The foundation of this world was built upon massive demographic shifts that occurred with blinding speed. Between 1910 and 1930, Central Harlem transformed from a predominantly white suburb into what was known as the Mecca of black culture. In 1910, only 9% of the population was African American, but by 1930, that figure had skyrocketed to 70%, fueled by thousands fleeing the Jim Crow South in search of economic opportunity and physical safety. However, they arrived in a city that, while lacking the explicit segregation laws of the South, enforced a robust system of structural discrimination in housing and employment that created a trap. You would find yourself in a neighborhood that was geographically small, roughly 3.5 square miles, yet packed with over 232,000 people by 1964. This density created a pressure cooker of existence where privacy was a myth and contagion was a neighbor. You would not last because the physical toll of the housing stock would grind you down before the sun even set. While the cultural elite resided in the palatial apartments of Sugar Hill and 409 Edgecombe Avenue, the reality for the vast majority was a struggle in overcrowded, dilapidated tenements. By the mid-1960s, 90% of Harlem's housing units were in buildings more than 30 years old, and nearly half were built before the turn of the 20th century. These were old law tenements, often lacking central heating or private bathrooms. Imagine trying to survive a New York winter in a cold water flat where the landlord refused to provide heat, a common occurrence that led to Central Harlem having the highest number of wintertime residential fires and deaths by gas poisoning in the city as residents tried desperately to stay warm. You would be living in quarters so cramped that they were described as rabbit warrens, spaces carved up to maximize rent extraction from a captive population. This environment was a colony, in the truest sense, as described by the psychologist Kenneth Clark. It was a place of extraction where the residents owned virtually nothing. Not their apartments, not the businesses, and often not even the illegal enterprises that flourished there. You would be navigating a landscape where the infant mortality rate was nearly double the citywide average, a statistic that speaks to a fundamental hostility to life itself. Survival here required a constitution hardened against tuberculosis, which claimed lives in Harlem at a rate far higher than the rest of the city, and against the psychological weight of knowing that you were paying a color tax on everything from rent to groceries. You paid higher prices for lower quality goods in stores owned by people who did not live in your community, creating an economic drain that left the neighborhood perpetually gasping for capital. In this vacuum of formal authority and economic despair, the community did not look to the city government for protection, for the government was viewed as an antagonistic force, much like the suitors in the Odyssey who consumed the wealth of Odysseus's house while providing nothing in return. Instead, the community looked to a shadow sovereign. Enter Ellsworth Raymond, Bumpy Johnson. To survive, you would have to recognize immediately that he, not the mayor or the police commissioner, was the true king of this urban Ithaca. Born in Charleston, South Carolina, in 1905, Johnson carried the trauma of the South with him. His older brother had been accused of killing a white man, forcing the family to mortgage their home to save him from a lynch mob. This early brush with the lethal consequences of racism instilled in Johnson a deep-seated insolence toward white authority, a trait that mirrored the rebellious nature of Odysseus toward the capricious gods. Arriving in Harlem in 1919 at age 14, Johnson was initially an outsider, mocked for his thick Southern accent and the bump on the back of his head that gave him his nickname. But like the mythic hero navigating the land of the Cyclopes, Johnson relied on a scrappy fighting ability and a legendary temper to carve out his space. By his late 20s, he had spent nearly half his life in prison, a descent into the underworld that served as his university. It was there that he transformed from a simple brawler into a reader of history and philosophy, a poet and a strategist. This intellectual depth allowed him to move seamlessly between the low culture of the street thug and the culture of the Harlem Renaissance elite. To last 24 hours here, you would need to understand that the man running the street was not just a criminal, but a man of many ways, a figure of profound complexity who filled the void left by a negligent state. If you managed to survive the physical environment, your next challenge would be navigating the economic engine that kept Harlem alive, the numbers racket. You would likely dismiss this as mere gambling, a vice to be avoided, but that mistake would cost you your social standing and perhaps your life. In Bumpy Johnson's Harlem, the numbers game, also known as policy, was not just a game of chance, it was the community's primary banking system. In an era when legitimate banks routinely denied loans to black businesses and homeowners regardless of their creditworthiness, the numbers bankers provided the liquid capital necessary for survival. To last a day, you would have to participate in this shadow economy, understanding its rules and its sanctity. The mathematics of the game were simple, ruthless, and ubiquitous. A bettor would select a 3-digit number between 1,000 and 999. The probability of winning was exactly 1 in 1,000, yet the payout was a lucrative 600 to 1. A single penny bet could return $6, and a dollar bet could return 600, a windfall that could pay a month's rent or save a family from eviction. The winning numbers were not drawn from a hat, but were derived from the financial figures of the New York Clearing House or the daily handle at local race tracks, making the result verifiable and public. This transparency was crucial. It built trust in a system that operated entirely outside the law. This economic ecosystem was the battlefield for a war that defined the era, a conflict you would be caught in the middle of if you walked the streets of the early 1930s. This was the policy war between the Harlem bankers and the white mobster Dutch Schultz. Schultz, the beer baron of the Bronx, saw the millions of dollars circulating in the Harlem numbers game, nickels and dimes aggregating into a fortune, and sought to seize it through brute force. He was the Polyphemus of this story, the Cyclops who lacked the cunning to rule but possessed the raw power to destroy. He offered black bankers a choice: relinquish their businesses to him or face death. Many capitulated, but one woman did not, Madame Stephanie St. Clair. To survive in this period, you would need to align yourself correctly in the court of the numbers queen. St. Clair, a fiery immigrant from Guadeloupe, refused to yield her territory. She was a woman of immense wealth and power, residing at the exclusive 409 Edgecombe Avenue, and she viewed the white infiltration of the numbers game not just as a business threat, but as an extension of Jim Crow segregation. She launched a campaign of resistance, urging her community to "Bay Black" and hiring Bumpy Johnson as her chief enforcer. This was the moment Bumpy Johnson ascended from a street soldier to a mythic protector. He waged a guerrilla war against Schultz's men, utilizing the terrain of Harlem to his advantage. Because white mobsters stood out in Harlem during the day, Johnson and his crew could pick them off with sniper-like precision, striking terror into a superior force. The violence was extreme. Over 40 murders and numerous kidnappings defined this struggle, but it was a violence with a political dimension. St. Clair and Johnson were fighting for the economic sovereignty of their neighborhood. The war climaxed in a way that fits the structure of classical tragedy. In 1935, Dutch Schultz was assassinated not by Johnson, but by the National Crime Syndicate on the orders of Lucky Luciano, who functioned as the Zeus or arbiter of this underworld pantheon. As Schultz lay dying, St. Clair sent him a telegram that has echoed through history. "As ye sow, so shall you reap. This biblical pronouncement marked the end of the siege. However, the peace that followed required a diplomatic cunning that you, the uninitiated traveler, would likely fail to comprehend. Bumpy Johnson negotiated a treaty with Lucky Luciano and the Genovese crime family. The deal allowed the black numbers bankers to retain their independence and autonomy on the condition that they paid a tribute to the mafia's central gambling pool. To the outside observer, it might look like capitulation. To the residents of Harlem, it was a victory. It was a peace with honor that stopped the bloodshed and maintained black control over the day-to-day operations of the game. Johnson became the bridge between these two worlds, the only man who could sit down for a game of chess with Lucky Luciano and then walk the streets of Harlem as a hero. He became the de facto boss, the man you had to see if you wanted to open a business, run a racket, or simply stay safe. Your inability to navigate this shadow state would be compounded by the fact that the greatest threat to your safety was often the very people sworn to protect you, the police. In Bumpy Johnson's Harlem, the New York Police Department was not a public service, it was an occupying army, and a corrupt one at that. To survive 24 hours, you would need to understand the pad. This was the systematized corruption that pervaded the 28th and 32nd precincts, which patrolled Harlem. It was not a matter of a few rogue cops taking an apple from a fruit stand. It was a highly organized extortion racket that rivaled the numbers game itself in its precision. Police officers in Harlem expected to be paid for allowing vice to exist. The monthly share of protection money collected by the police was significantly higher in Harlem than in other parts of the city. While a plainclothes squad in Midtown might collect $300 a month per man, in Harlem, the Gold Coast, of corruption, that figure could reach $1,500. This was because the police knew exactly how much money was flowing through the numbers racket and the narcotics trade, and they demanded their cut. If you were a numbers runner or a banker, you paid the police not just to look the other way, but to protect your operation from competitors. The police were, in effect, the enforcement arm of the highest bidder. As a newcomer, you would likely make the fatal mistake of trusting a uniform. You might witness a brutality that would shock your modern sensibilities. The relationship between the community and the police was defined by violence. This tension exploded periodically, most notably in the riots of 1935 and 1943, and later in 1964. The 1943 riot, for instance, began when a black soldier intervened to stop a white police officer from arresting a black woman, resulting in the soldier being shot. Rumors spread instantly, igniting a conflagration that destroyed white-owned businesses and left 6 people dead. The police response was often indiscriminate violence. Officers were known to beat anyone found on the street, regardless of whether they were rioting or simply trying to get home. In 1964, the cycle repeated. A white police lieutenant, Thomas Gilligan, shot and killed a 15-year-old boy named James Powell. The incident sparked days of unrest, with Molotov cocktails flying from rooftops and police firing thousands of rounds of ammunition into the air and sometimes into crowds. The Tactical Patrol Force, a riot control unit, was deployed with a mandate to clear the streets by any means necessary, often chanting, "Kill, kill, kill," as they beat residents with nightsticks. In this environment, Bumpy Johnson's role as a buffer became even more critical. He was the one who could negotiate with the police, who could bribe a judge, or who could ensure that a young man arrested for a minor offense didn't disappear into the system forever. He paid the rent for the destitute, bought school clothes for children, and hosted community feasts. This, Robin Hood, persona was not a contradiction to his criminal life, it was the source of his legitimacy. He provided the protection that the state refused to offer. To survive a day in this world, you would also have to master the manhood ranking system, a social hierarchy as rigid as any feudal court. In a community where traditional avenues to power, wealth, politics, land ownership, were systematically blocked, personal honor and the ability to command respect became the primary currency. The streets classified men into categories: the punk, the hard, the bad, and the crazy. A punk was a coward, prey for the strong. A hard man could fight, but a bad man like Bumpy Johnson was a professional in violence, a man who used force with surgical precision to achieve an objective. But the highest and most feared category was the crazy nigger, a man who had abandoned the fear of death entirely, who would take on the police or the entire world without hesitation. Johnson embodied the bad and the crazy simultaneously. He was known for carrying a switchblade and a gun, and stories of his violence were legendary, like the time he allegedly fought a rival named Ulysses Rollins, stabbing him 36 times in a single street fight, or the time he walked into a dining club, spotted Rollins again, and gouged his eye out with a knife before calmly returning to his meal, proclaiming a sudden craving for spaghetti and meatballs. These stories, whether entirely factual or embellished by the myth making of the streets, served a functional purpose. They established his sovereignty. To cross him was to invite death. To survive, you would have to show immediate, unwavering respect to this hierarchy. A misplaced glance, a failure to step aside on the sidewalk, or a tone of disrespect could be a death sentence for the uninitiated. But even kings must descend into the underworld. For Bumpy Johnson, this nekia came in 1952, when he was indicted for conspiracy to sell heroin. He was sentenced to 15 years and sent to Alcatraz, the most notorious federal penitentiary in America. As inmate No. 17, he lived in extreme isolation, cut off from the kingdom he had built. Yet, even in this abyss, his legend grew. It is said that he maintained his influence from behind bars and may have even facilitated the famous 1962 escape of Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers by arranging for a boat to pick them up in the bay. He remained in the underworld for over a decade, a king in exile, while his kingdom began to rot. While Johnson was away, the landscape of Harlem shifted. The Lotus Eaters arrived in the form of the heroin epidemic. In the 1930s and 40s, the numbers racket was the primary vice, a largely nonviolent, community-supported economic activity. But by the 1950s and 60s, narcotics had taken over. The Italian mob, specifically the Genovese family, took advantage of Johnson's absence to flood Harlem with heroin, viewing the black community merely as a market to be exploited. When Johnson returned from Alcatraz in 1963, greeted by an impromptu parade of Harlemites cheering his Nostos, or homecoming, he found a neighborhood in disarray. The streets were meaner, the addiction was rampant, and the code of honor he had ruled by was fraying. The tragedy of Johnson's final years was his struggle against this hydra. He attempted to regain control, but the drug trade was a different beast than the numbers game. It was destructive, predatory, and controlled by forces far larger than one man. Johnson's own complexity was laid bare here. He was accused of being a drug trafficker, yet he also despised what heroin was doing to his people. His relationship with Malcolm X during this period highlights this duality. They had been friends since the 1940s when Malcolm was Detroit Red, a street hustler. Now, Malcolm was a global icon of black liberation, and Bumpy was the elder statesman of the underworld. Despite their divergent paths, they shared a mutual respect as protectors of the black community. Johnson even provided security for Malcolm X when the latter broke with the Nation of Islam, understanding that the police would not protect a black radical. Malcolm eventually declined this protection, unwilling to be associated with a gangster, a decision that left him vulnerable to his assassins. Your 24 hours in Bumpy Johnson's Harlem would end where his life did a table in Wells Restaurant on July 7, 1968. It was a place where the high and low of Harlem met, a sanctuary of soul food and jazz. At the age of 62, under federal indictment once again for drug conspiracy, Johnson sat down for a meal of chicken legs and hominy grits. He was not gunned down by a rival. He was not executed by the state. He simply clutched his chest and died of a heart attack, collapsing into the arms of his childhood friend, Junie Bird. His death was the final act of the epic. The Godfather was gone, and with him went the era where a single man could act as a buffer between a marginalized community and a hostile world. The shadow state he built, a complex web of economics, violence, and philanthropy, could not outlive him. If you were there, you would realize that surviving Bumpy Johnson's Harlem wasn't just about dodging bullets or knives. It was about understanding that you were in a place that had declared its own independence, a place with its own king, its own laws, and its own tragic destiny. You wouldn't last because you would be looking for the rules of New York City, failing to see that you were standing in the court of a shadow sovereign who held the weight of a neglected world on his shoulders until his heart finally gave out.